Hi, friends. We are finishing up probably the next couple of weeks the life and teachings of Christ. I've been sharing this series with you, and last week we ended with the upper room, Jesus with the disciples in Jerusalem, celebrating Passover. We see the defection of Judas, the betrayal. He goes out into the night, betrays Jesus for, I think we said, $20. Can you believe that? 30 pieces of silver was the equivalent. So now in Matthew 26, that's where we are. We pick up in verse 36. After Jesus gives some more instructions, he says, let us go to a place called Gethsemane. I was there 12 years ago, 13 years ago in Jerusalem on a tour, and it is a part garden and part orchard. And the big thing there was olives, and they created a press to crush the oil out of the olives. So this is where he was going every night, kind of like a little bit of respite, away from the crowds and all of that. But Judas knew the place because he had been with them every night. So this was where the battle of Calvary was fought, in the Spirit, in prayer. And Jesus knows physical pain and mental anguish await him. He takes with him 3 of the disciples, verse 37. He took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, James and John, and began to be grieved and distressed. Then he said to them, my soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch with me. And he went a little beyond them and fell on his face and prayed, saying, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. Some people think, Jesus had a fear of death. I don't believe that. He knew he was meant to die. He had to in order to atone for the sins of all mankind. But what he was feeling here in his humanness, if you will, was the tasting of a bitter cup that sin had poisoned. He had to drink of that cup, metaphorically. So he becomes a sin offering. And the disciples fall asleep, Peter, James, and John. They get relief in slumber twice. He wakes them up the first time, and then he lets them sleep. And we see that he says, get up, verse 46, let us be going. Behold, the one who betrays me is at hand. Judas Iscariot is coming with an escort of some Roman soldiers, officers from the chief priests, elders of the people. They come out with swords and clubs, torches and lanterns to arrest Jesus. Remember, we said Judas probably was trying to salvage in his own mind what little he could for the 3-year sacrifice he made in following Jesus. His disappointment leads to bitterness, and so he betrays the Lord, taking this armed escort from the high priest to arrest what they would probably see as an agitator. Now, verse 48, as he was betraying him, he gave them a sign, saying, whomever I kiss, he is the one. And immediately Judas went to Jesus and said, hail, Rabbi, and kissed him. This was a customary thing for a disciple to kiss his master on the cheek, kind of a sign of honor, even of submission. And yet here it's an act of betrayal, the Judas kiss, if you're familiar with that term. Why was it a sign? Because the Roman soldiers probably did not know Jesus by sight. Jesus did not spend a lot of time in those 3 years in Jerusalem, mostly for the feasts. Soldiers would have been on duty. He was in Galilee most of the time. Soldiers really, weren't in Galilee a lot. So they see the kiss, and they know this is the one. Jesus even says, friend, do what you have come for. They lay hands on him and seize him. So this is what takes place here. Now, we're going to jump around to a few of the other Gospels, actually all 4 of them really, give you different pictures of this event. I want to look at Luke 22 and verses 47 and 48. It says basically a repeat of Matthew 26, the betraying of the kiss, but something happens here. Well, let me get, before that one, let me get to John chapter 18. I think we should do this in order, even though the Gospels don't have this in chronological order. In John chapter 18, something very, very interesting takes place here. When Jesus had spoken these words, they go out, across the Kidron ravine. Judas knew the place where they were, the Roman cohort, and they come up to him. And he says to them, "Whom do you seek?" They answered, "Jesus the Nazarene." And he said, "I am he." Judas was betraying him. He's standing there too. When he said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Isn't that interesting? What was that? The power of God was so present there, the soldiers couldn't stand. The cohort had to fall at the presence of Jesus. They got back up again. "Whom do you seek?" he says. "Jesus the Nazarene. I told you, I am he. Let these go on their way if I'm the one you're seeking." Now, Simon Peter, impulsive Simon, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's slave, a man by the name of Malchus. Jesus says to Peter, "Put the sword into the sheath. The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink it?" Corresponding passage in Luke chapter 22, we see something that Luke, being a doctor, definitely wants to highlight here, and that's this. In verse 51, Jesus says, "Stop, no more of this." And he touched the ear and healed him. This was the last act of healing by Jesus as the Messiah before his trial, death, and resurrection. The ear is on the ground. He picks it up and puts it back on the servant of the high priest. You would think, wow, there's something to this man. But no, they're under orders and they want to bring him in. Jesus says, "This hour and the power of darkness are yours." Think of this. Jesus' intervention here to heal the servant's ear probably saved Peter's life, because the soldiers, after being in awe of the miracle of it, probably could have shown vengeance here and killed him. And that was a sincere effort on Peter's part to defend Jesus, although it was misguided. So Peter's life is saved. Now, another thing I want to bring out here is in the Gospel of Mark, which is really, I've said this before in this series of studies, is really the Gospel of Peter. Peter is relaying all these things to Mark, who wasn't a disciple at the time. He was probably a teenager here. And I want to bring out something here in Mark chapter 14, a little known verse. A lot of people don't even, or aren't even aware of this. So all the disciples flee, verse 51, Mark 14. "A young man was following him," Jesus, "wearing nothing but a linen sheet over his naked body, and they seized him. But he pulled free of the linen sheet and escaped naked." You don't find this in John, Luke, or Matthew. Why? Scholars believe this was Mark himself. Probably got wind of a betrayal and an arrest of Jesus about to take place. He comes out having been sleeping, comes to warn Jesus. And like I said, he's very young here, probably like a teenager. And as he comes out, they grab the sheet and he escapes with nothing on. It's kind of like his way of saying, "I was there. That was me." Although a lot of the New Testament writers do not proclaim themselves. John calls himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. He doesn't say, "Me, John." Mark doesn't say, "That was me." They're humble. So he escapes. Now, something else I came across in my research, Mark was known as the stump-fingered one. Could this have possibly been this incident right here where a Roman sword was unleashed, slashed his fingers off, he drops, they've got the sheet, the linen sheet, he escapes naked into the night? Possibly. I know there's some speculation here. That doesn't say it here in Scripture, but the tradition, church fathers called him the stump-fingered one, possibly lost his fingers from a Roman sword. All right, getting back over to Matthew 26 again. The cohort takes Jesus to the high priest. Well, first they take him to Annas, who was the former high priest, elderly man. They always called him the high priest, even though Caiaphas, his son-in-law, was the current high priest. But Annas was high priest for many years. It's kind of like in our country when we see a former president, we don't call him Mr. whatever, we say Mr. President. Okay, so the position, one of honor and respect. Caiaphas calls a night trial, which, according to the Sanhedrin, was really done illegally. They had to have at least 23 members, was it 72, something like that, present in order to convene and call it a trial. The night trial was illegal. Why did they do it at night? Probably because they feared the multitude getting up in the morning, finding out Jesus was arrested, and causing an uprising. So this way, they're under cover of darkness, and they don't have to deal with any of Jesus' followers, the multitude, the crowd. So in Matthew 26, verse 59, they're trying to bring up charges against him because they know they can't kill him themselves. They're under the jurisdiction of Rome. They have to have the Roman governor sanction carrying out a death sentence, which we would call a capital offense. So nothing really was going to hold in the way that they were looking at this. He violated our law. He's not a true rabbi. The Romans wouldn't have even cared about anything like that. They would have dismissed the case. So they said something about this man said, he will destroy the temple. Now, Jesus never said he would destroy the temple. He said, destroy this temple, which they thought was a reference to the Jerusalem temple built by Solomon. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Now, we know he was speaking metaphorically of his body, but they don't get that. And they're divided. They're divided over this. They're divided over whether he was pro-Roman or not. So they had to have a political aspiration, even a charge of blasphemy, saying he was, a divine being the Romans wouldn't have cared anything about. So a political aspiration had to be trumped up. Now back to Luke in verse 23, the first couple of verses. It says this, the whole body of them got up, brought him before Pilate, and they said, we found this man misleading our nation, forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar. See, they got to bring Caesar into it. Political. And saying that he himself is Christ. And that doesn't hold any water with Pilate, who's the Roman governor. Now, you need to know something about Pilate in the research. He was hated by the Jews for various reasons. One, when he became governor, he had his soldiers come in holding banners that had a picture of the Roman emperor, Tiberius, I believe it was, marching through Jerusalem. The Jews hated that. They knew that they were under the jurisdiction of Rome, but a lot of times Rome would allow them to have religious freedom and exercise it, wouldn't hassle them with their laws or these things. But that was a big one, to have the picture of the Roman governor, the emperor rather, on these flags, and other things he did. So the report always got back to Tiberius, who's Pilate's boss. He doesn't want to upset and offend these Jews during Passover when his track record isn't that great with Tiberius, interestingly, 10 years after this whole ordeal, he is deported and put into exile for various other things he did to the Jews. So he's kind of dismissing this whole thing, or trying to. But he had an interest in Jesus and probably saw him as a nobler character than the accusers, definitely Caiaphas, the elders, the Sanhedrin, all of them. But he did not figure on a violent reaction from the Sanhedrin. They were calling for his blood. He wanted no part of a riot that would jeopardize his position. So, what happens? We have him hearing that Jesus, they said he was a Galilean. Luke 23:5. They say he stirs up the people, teaching all over Judea, starting from Galilee, even as far as this place, Jerusalem. When Pilate heard that, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. We know Jesus was born in Bethlehem, so he wasn't a Galilean by birth. But when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself happened to be in Jerusalem at that time for the Passover. Pilate wanted to get off the hook. He was trying to find a way out. So he sends him to Herod, who is, we said, he's an Edomite. He's a half Jew. And Herod had wanted to see Jesus for a long time. Verse 8, Luke 23. He'd heard about him, and he was hoping to see some sign performed by him. He questioned at some length, but he answered him nothing. Chief priests standing by, scribes, accusing him. Herod, after a while, bored with it, treats him with contempt, mocks him, dresses him in a gorgeous robe, sends him back to Pilate. He had a royal curiosity, but no response from Jesus. Herod was a non-player in this whole thing. He wasn't going to give him anything. Now, interestingly, if Jesus performed some kind of miraculous sign, I think Herod would have released him, because that's what he was looking to do. Pilate gave him free rein with him, but nothing happens, so he sends him back to Pilate. Can you imagine Pilate's face when they bring Jesus back into the praetorium where he's presiding? That's the last thing he wanted to see. I've got to deal with this again. So he resumes the case in Luke chapter 23. And I think I'm going to stop here just because the next part is going to take some time, and I don't want to go over my time frame, but we're going to look at next week the trial, Barabbas, the scourging, the crucifixion. So we go from Gethsemane to Golgotha. And this was the spectacle. All the disciples fled. We're going to find out that Peter and John accompany Jesus, although at a distance, and they get into, the court. So just wanted to share some things with this. I know a lot of you are familiar with this story. I'll bet you didn't know about Mark, especially the stump-fingered one. That was interesting. And we'll cover this next week, the crucifixion of Jesus and leading up to the resurrection. All right, God bless. Have a good weekend.